My voice is coming clearly, inshallah. Just want to make sure that you can hear me. Can somebody just write a chat messages? Okay. Alhamdulillah. I hope you guys are all keeping well. Inshallah, we have another session before us talking about the sulh of Imam al-Hasan, alayhi salam. Okay, so just first of all, to recap, I'll get started now, inshallah. It's been 5 minutes past the time that we had allocated. So yeah, just to recap quickly some of the material that we covered in the last session. First of all, as a side point, it's interesting to note that we have a hadith narrated by the Sunnis, and I'm sure also the Shia as well, that indicates very clearly that the Holy Prophet had already indicated that this sulh would happen. For example, in one of the ahadith that is in Sahih al-Bukhari, the important source of ahadith for our Sunni brothers, it says that the Prophet ﷺ said about Imam al-Hasan, "Inna ibni hadha sayyidun." My son is a sayyid, is a leader. وَلَعَلَّ اللَّهَ أَن يُصْلَحَ بِهِ بَيْنَ فِئَتَيْنِ عَظِيمَتَيْن مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And perchance Allah will cause through him a sulh to happen between two great parties, two great groups of the Muslims. So last week we spoke very briefly about this matter. We introduced the concept of the sulh, and we spoke very briefly about this fabrication about how Imam Hassan had many wives, right? And we talked about how that was something that had been fabricated later on by the Banu al-Abbas to make Imam Hassan look bad. And we gave many, many different proofs that show that, although it is something that is unfortunately there in our very important books of hadith, and some of our ulama have tried to justify it, but there is enough evidence to make us certain that this is a fabrication. Interestingly enough, in this last week, I came across an article written more than 40 years ago by Marhum Sayyid Sa'id Akhtar Badawi, from Toronto's father. I'll just give you the link to it. It's also concluding the exact same thing. He has some very interesting analysis in this article that we didn't discuss. So if anybody has the time, they can look at it. But the conclusion is the same, that this is a fabrication of Mansur, the first or the second Abbasid caliph. Then last week we went through a historical overview of some of the main events that happened in these less than 1 year period of the caliphate of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. So from the time that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam died in the month of Ramadan, 1440 AH, until about the month Rabi' al-Thani. Different accounts say either Rabi' al-Awwal or Rabi' al-Thani or even Jamadi al-Ula, but more likely it is Rabi' al-Thani of the year 41 AH that the actual sulh was agreed upon. Interestingly enough, I was thinking it's just in these same days that we are. So exactly 1401 years ago was when this sulh happened. So right now we are in the end of Rabi' al-Awwal. Okay, then the main thing that we put forward last week were a number of puzzling questions. That why did Imam al-Hasan choose to act in this way and not this way? Why did he choose to go to war? Why did he choose to then sign a sulh? Why did he choose Ubaidullah bin Abbas, who if he was going to betray, surely Imam Hassan must have had an inkling, must have had an idea that he was not a trustworthy person. Why did he appoint him to be the head of his army? And then most importantly, why did Imam Hassan sign this peace treaty? How is this an example of Islamic teachings? If Islamic teachings are exemplified in the personality of Imam al-Hasan, can we understand the reasoning behind it or not? Over here, I give you a verse of the Holy Quran. There's a verse that says in Surah Al-Anfal, verse number 15 and 16, it says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, إذا لقيتم الذين كفروا زحفا فلا تولوهم الأدبار ومن يولهم يومئذ دبره إلا متحرفا لقتال أو متحيزا إلى فئة فقد باء بغضب من الله ومأواه جهنم. That all you who have faith, when you encounter the faithless advancing for battle, then do not turn your backs to flee from them. Whoever turns his back to flee from them that day shall certainly earn Allah's wrath, and his refuge shall be hell, and evil destination, unless in one condition you are allowed to turn your back. What is that? Unless he is diverting to fight or retiring towards another troop. That was the term in the verse. إلا متحرفا لقتال أو متحيزا إلى فئة. Inshallah, with the help of Allah, I want to try to illustrate that what Imam al-Hasan was doing was an example of this. That he was not giving up on the struggle against kufr. At the end of the last session, we spoke in detail about how Muawiyah exemplified shirk. He was not like another Muslim who was vying for the leadership with Imam al-Hasan. No, no, this was the same band of the Banu Umayyah, the same symbol of shirk that one day under Abu Sufyan, it was fighting against the Prophet in Badr and Uhud and Ahzab. Today now it is fighting against Imam Ali and Imam al-Hasan under Muawiyah. There is nothing in Muawiyah that represents Islam. Everything that he represents is shirk and disobedience and following his nafs and putting his nafs forward. So we talked about that last week. Inshallah, today we want to go into the details of answering these questions. Again, if you can just give me assurance that my voice is coming through clearly, and if there's no questions, inshallah, we will continue. You can hear me fine, right? Okay. Okay, great. The private question added. I'm not too sure how to see the private questions. Inshallah, I'll look at it later. Okay, so first of all, the first thing I want to mention here is this huge responsibility that was thrust upon Imam al-Hasan with the death of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. The Muslim world was almost entirely under the rule of Imam Ali. You can see in this map before you how large and vast the Muslim world was. It stretched from Khurasan in the east all the way to North Africa in the west. It's stretched up to Armenia in the north and down to Yemen in the south. It was a huge, vast land, and all of it, other than Muawiyah's land, was under the control of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And last week I tried to mention in brief, and again I will mention it briefly here, that establishing an Islamic government is a very, very important goal that Islam clearly has. The Holy Prophet in Medina, he was the head of an Islamic government. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he was denied his right for 25 years, but when the Ummah came to him and did Itmam Hujjat and showed him that they really wanted to have him as their leader, he took up the leadership. And when we look at the teachings of Islam and how so much of it pertain to society, when we look at how Islam has all these things to say about society, it is only natural that the head of an Islamic government should be the most knowledgeable about Islam. The epitome of that in the time of the Imams was the Imam alayhi salam. And naturally, if we look at what actually happens in history, what happened in history, if we think about it, a government has a very, very deep effect on the people. The people emulate their leaders. People are affected by the policies that the government puts forward, and an Islamic government would put forward policies to help the akhirat of people. They would do things to allow people to go closer to Allah. So to achieve that goal that Allah has for mankind, where everybody should achieve their goal of taqwa and purity and piety and move all of society towards that goal that Allah has, the most powerful means of that is establishing an Islamic government. So this was no small responsibility that Imam Hassan was in charge of this entire Muslim world. And like I said last week, in an unprecedented manner, all of the Muslim world, other than Muawiyah, pledged allegiance to Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam after the death of Imam Ali. Kufa, despite the many different factions that we will now come to, Kufa unanimously, everybody pledged allegiance to Imam Hassan. There was an extreme fervor in the city of Kufa, and people were all moved together. They came, of course, many of them were hypocrites. They were hiding their true colors, no doubt about it. But overtly, it appeared that the numbers were with Imam al-Hassan initially. Not only the city of Kufa, but Hijaz and Yemen and Iran and all of these lands, the previous governors that Imam Ali had appointed there, they procured the allegiance for Imam al-Hassan. So in that sense, Imam al-Hassan was now the head of the Islamic government, and he had a heavy responsibility to provide safety and security for his citizens. I told you in the last session, I believe, that Muawiyah, towards the end of Imam Ali's life, he had begun a policy of trying to cause chaos throughout the Muslim worlds. He sent armies to Yemen. He sent an army to Yemen, to Hijaz. One of his armies was under a ruthless individual called Busr, who massacred thousands of people. He tried to pillage and cause chaos throughout the lands of Imam Ali to weaken the rulership of Imam Ali alayhi salam. So in this situation, there was no choice that Imam Ali and Imam al-Hassan had other than to send an army to put an end to this rebellion of Muawiyah. And so it is in this light that Imam Hassan had to continue. I said that Imam Ali had begun to plan for another war after what had happened in Siffin. The Battle of Siffin had ended in that hakimiyat that the Khawarij forced upon Imam Ali. But towards the end of his life, prior to his being martyred, Imam Ali had garrisoned a large army, preparing to go out to Sham and put an end to Muawiyah for once and for all. So this answers some of the questions that we put forward last week, that why is it that Imam Hassan had to take up the allegiance? If people gave him allegiance, why did he take up the Khilafat? It answers the question that why did he start a war with Muawiyah? It was Muawiyah that was the aggressor by not submitting to the rule of the Ahlul Bayt, who were the true rulers who had been appointed by the Prophet on the one hand and given the bay'at of almost all of the Muslim world. So it was Muawiyah who was the aggressor in this regard, and with all his policies of causing chaos and whatnot. That is why Imam Hassan was forced to deal very strongly with Muawiyah. Okay, if there's no questions, now we want to go and look at the unfortunate situation that, okay, Imam Hassan initially he started a movement to go and fight against Muawiyah. We spoke a little bit last week about his very, very amazing military tactics of dividing the forces amongst two cities, and we spoke in detail about that. I won't go into that again. But unfortunately, as events showed, there was a lot of problems and hypocrisy and division in the army of Imam al-Hassan. To get something of an idea of this situation, let us say the following, that as these points you can see on the slide in front of you, first of all, there were many different groups that made up the army of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Ideologically, in terms of their belief, we had the Khawarij, who were a large group. Even though they had almost all been wiped out in Nahrawan, very quickly their message spread. There was something about their message that was very catchy and very convincing. And a lot of people in Kufa, some of the heads were Shimr bin Diljoshan and Shabath bin Rabi'i, but there were many, many Khawarij. One of the analysis that some of our ulama have made is that the Khawarij were so worried about the evil consequences that awaited them when they killed Imam Ali alayhi salam, that initially they hid themselves. In these early times of Imam Hassan's caliphate, they pretended to be like other Shias. They were there with the other Shias giving bay'at to Imam Hassan, pretending to join the army to go and fight Muawiyah. But in reality, they were waiting for any opportunity to cause chaos, cause anarchy, rebel against Imam Hassan, kill Imam Hassan, as we will see. But they were a huge faction that was initially quiet and made up part of the army of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Another very important group was the people who actually were working for Muawiyah. again, I mentioned last week, I think, that large numbers of spies were there in the army of Imam al-Hasan. One of the policies of Muawiyah that he was always ready to spend huge amounts of money for was to bribe people, to buy out people. He sent letters to people that if you kill Imam Hassan, I will give you this much money, I will marry you to my daughter. He had many people who were working for him. That was another group. Of course, we have the real Shia as well, who were few in number, but they were there in the army of Imam al-Hassan. Then we have people who were just there because of tribal reasons. They had the head of their tribe who had joined the army. They didn't have any commitment to Islam. They weren't doing it for religious reasons. There were other people there who just wanted to gain money. They thought that, oh, it seems that Imam Hassan will win this war. Initially, the numbers were maybe slightly large, and he was a strong leader, given his being the son of the Holy Prophet, grandson of the Holy Prophet. It seemed that initially the fervor would have led people to believe that he would win the war, and so large numbers of people just joined the army in the hopes of gaining booty from the war. Another aspect of the army of Imam al-Hasan is that ethnically they were very divided. Kufa, being a city that was the capital of the Muslim Empire, close to Iran. In fact, it was essentially part of Iran that had been conquered under the second caliph. And it was founded as a city for the army to kind of base itself. Anyways, Kufa had a very diverse population of Arabs and Iranians, as well as huge numbers of children of slaves. So these were like half Arab, half African, or half Arab, half other ethnicities that were called al-Hamra, or even entirely Africans. And these also made up a huge number of the dark-skinned people, basically. There were huge numbers of the army were also from that group. Naturally, such divisions would cause an army to be weak. It would cause an army to not be united. Another aspect of the army of Imam al-Hasan that led to the very sorry state that we will see is that the morale was very low. These people of Kufa were tired of fighting. Under the government of Imam Ali alayhi salam, back to back, year after year, there were wars. Wars in the Battle of Jamal, the Battle of Nahrawan, the Battle of Siffin. Towards the end of his life, Imam Ali was complaining that these people of Kufa don't listen to me. When I tell them to go out to war in the summertime, they say it's too hot. When I tell them to go in the winter, they say it's too cold. The point was they were weak in their faith, and that weakness led them to not want to fight anymore. Keep in mind the huge number of casualties. In the Battle of Jamal, 30,000 people were killed. In the Battle of Nahrawan, 4,000. Although these 4,000 were almost all exclusively from the Khawarij. The Battle of Siffin, 110,000. So there were huge losses, and people were tired of fighting. Moreover, they didn't want to fight in a sense because the people they were often fighting with were Arabs from the same background as themselves. They were from the same tribes or same families or people that they knew. They didn't want to fight with one another. Another aspect that very strongly affected the morale of the army of Imam al-Hasan was that the head of the army, imagine the first person who Imam Hassan keeps in charge. I said last week that Imam Hassan initially went to Madain and he sent the bulk of his army north towards Muskin to go and stop Muawiyah. Under who? Under his cousin Ubaydullah bin Abbas. Ubaydullah bin Abbas, when he reached Muskin, a letter from Muawiyah came to him that promised him 1,000,000 dirhams if he were to betray. And he did. Maybe there were other things promised to him as well. Anyways, at night he deserted and fled to the camp of Muawiyah, and in the morning the army sees that their commander is gone. A few points here I want to just say about why did Imam Hassan choose him if he was such a weak individual. Unfortunately, we can't say that Imam Hassan had any evidence to show prior to this that Ubaydullah was a weak individual. In fact, Ubaydullah had posts under the government of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Imam Ali had appointed him at least once, if not more than once, to be the head of the caravan that goes to Hajj. He had appointed him to be the governor of Yemen. So he had this, very good past. Moreover, two of his sons had been killed. I said a few moments earlier that Muawiyah had a policy of pillaging and sending armies to go and kill innocent people. One of those armies that came to Yemen and Hijaz killed two of the sons of Ubaydullah bin Abbas. And moreover, he was from the Banu Hashim. So it would be only expected from such a person who has a history of serving the Ahlul Bayt, who is from the Ahlul Bayt, who has that tribal impetus and encouragement to fight for the cause of Imam Hassan, who has a personal vendetta against Muawiyah because Muawiyah was the cause of his two sons being killed. Such a person one would hope that he would be a very strong and very good choice to lead the army. But alas, his nafs got the better of him and he showed his true weakness and his true colors, and very early when he reached this place of Maskin against the army of Muawiyah, he betrayed Hassan. And with that, you can only imagine what that did to the morale of the army. We will show on the next slide what it did to the numbers. Even the numbers of the army were very, very heavily affected by this treason of Ubaydullah. A final aspect on this slide that I want to mention to keep in mind about the army of Imam Hassan is that the army was very negatively affected by all of these rumors. Like I said, Muawiyah had paid spies. He was ready to pay huge amounts of money to anybody who would work for him. And he had many people working for him in the army of Imam al-Hassan. In both the armies, in both the camps of Madain and Maskin, there were people who were working for Muawiyah spreading rumors. In the camp of Maskin, where the army was, they spread rumors that, Imam Hassan has already signed a sulh. He's already agreed to do a sulh. Same thing in the camp of Madain, where Imam was, before Imam had even begun to think about a sulh, they were already spreading rumors that he has agreed to a sulh. All of these aspects very negatively affected the army of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. Another aspect is the actual numbers. So over here, like I said last week, we have many different accounts of this history of what happened. Many different historical sources have narrated this episode of Imam al-Hassan, and there are very, very conflicting reports. One thing that's for sure is that the army that was sent north to Maskin under Ubaydullah consisted of 12,000 forces. Here there is a very clear letter of Imam al-Hassan where he's telling Ubaydullah that I'm sending you with this responsibility with 12,000 forces under your command. Incidentally, he also commands Ubaydullah to treat the army very well. Also, incidentally, another point that I didn't mention in the last slide is that he also didn't make Ubaydullah the exclusive leader of the army. He told Ubaydullah to do mashwara with certain other individuals. And so it was almost like a joint leadership between three individuals, but the main head was Ubaydullah bin Abbas. So anyways, 12,000 is the number that Imam Hassan alayhi salam sends north to Maskin. Like I said, there are different accounts of how many people are in the army. Some accounts are much larger, but a contemporary historian whose book I have relied on a lot, it's a very comprehensive analysis of this whole sulh, the whole episode, is an Iraqi scholar by the name of Sheikh Ali Yassin. In his analysis, he says that the only number that we can be sure about is a much smaller number of about 20,000, or a little bit more than 20,000. He has his own analysis that those higher accounts of 40,000, for example, he rejects them. He says that in one place they're narrated by somebody who was not even in the city of Kufah at that time, like Ziyad bin Abi, a very important individual, Ubaydullah bin Ziyad's father. He says Ziyad at that time, he picked a larger number for his own interest in how he narrated it. He wasn't even in the city of Kufah at that time. He didn't know exactly how big the army of Imam Hassan was. Anyways, he in this book, Sheikh Ali Yassin has very comprehensively analyzed all of the different accounts, and his conclusion is that we can't be certain that there was anything more than 20,000 or a little bit more than 20,000. It's unlikely that it was more than that. On the other hand, Muawiyah's forces were much larger. He had an army of about 60,000 individuals that he had brought from Sham all the way to Iraq. And then another interesting thing that to keep in mind is that when Ubaydullah fled, with him huge numbers of people deflected. From that army of 12,000, after a while 8,000 people had fled. Apparently they had joined the camp of Muawiyah. So you can imagine how small the army that Imam Hassan is left with was, and how low the morale was. The only possible outcome of engaging in war with such numbers was certain defeat. There was one other point I wanted to mention here before we continue. Actually, I wanted to mention it in the last slide, but I'll say it now. Another question I posed last week was, why didn't Imam al-Hasan take the steps of getting rid of all these, hypocrites from his army? From the beginning, why didn't he filter out the Khawarij and only have an army of Shia, of people who are loyal to him? The answer to that perhaps is that the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they couldn't act based on their hidden knowledge. They had to go with the apparent situation. When they see a Muslim who comes before them and says that I am a Muslim, I'm ready to fight for you, Islamically, they had to allow them to enter the army. Even the armies of Imam Ali alayhi salam, the army even of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, they were afflicted by such problems. In the Battle of Hunain, I think it was, that happened after the conquest of Makkah, the Holy Prophet ﷺ had a huge army, but still they were routed by a small force of the enemy because the Prophet's army was not sincere. Abu Sufyan was even in that army at that time. There were hypocrites, there were people who didn't fight for the cause of Allah, they were just trying to get booty of war, who were even in the army of the Holy Prophet. So if these problems afflicted the Prophet and Imam Ali, and alayhi salam, then it's only natural that the same thing would happen to Imam Hassan. And another point that we have to keep in mind that answers some of the other questions that we posed last week is that Imam Hassan had a very delicate situation before him where he knew that there were all these different factions in the city of Kufah. He knew that the Khawarij were there. He knew that the Banu Umayyah had their people there in Kufah. He didn't want to take a step to ignite a fitna and cause chaos in his city, in his own army, when it was not necessary to take a certain step. That's why, for example, even though he eventually started to head out to fight Muawiyah, initially after people gave allegiance to Imam Hassan, he waited. I said this last week, that initially there was a back and forth of letters between him and Muawiyah where he delayed, almost as if he wanted to show people that, look, I don't want to fight Muawiyah. Muawiyah is the aggressor here. He is coming out with an army to me. And so he didn't want to give an excuse to the Khawarij to show their true colors. For now, they were in his army. He wanted to play it safe and have a strong army that was going out with him to go and fight. So given some of these situations, inshallah, a lot of the questions that we posed last week have begun to be answered. But we still have the main question, that why did Imam Hassan not fight, even with a small number that he had, even with an army with low morale where many people had abandoned him? Couldn't he somehow have gone and fought, even if it led to the end of his life? Wouldn't that be shahada? Wouldn't that be what happened to Imam Hussein? Why didn't he still fight, even when all these odds were against him? That's the question that we now want to answer. I just want to make sure that you guys are with me, listening. If somebody can, please give me a chat that my voice is still coming through clearly. Okay, great. So with that, inshallah, we want to head now to the main question that we have tonight for me here at home. Oh, okay. So before actually we come to this, just to get an idea of how bad the army was, very quickly, I want to tell you two incidents that happened. one incident that some people are writing private questions, inshallah, after the end of the class, I will try to. Or, okay, let me just try to figure this out right now. How is it that I access these private questions? View audience questions, I see. Okay, no, both of them say just yes. I see. Okay. Okay, let's go on. So two I want to narrate to show you the situation that Imam Hassan alayhi salam had, how bad, how unloyal his army was, how really madloom this Imam of ours was. In one incident that is narrated in different accounts of history, Imam Hassan gives a khutbah to his army. He tries to encourage them that we need to go and fight against Muawiyah, but he tells them straight up that Muawiyah has also offered me a peace treaty. He is telling me to not fight and to engage in a sulh. So what is your response? He asks the army. I won't read the whole khutbah, although I have it here before me, but basically it appears he was trying to encourage them. He was telling them that what's wrong with you guys? Back in Siffin, when you fought against Muawiyah, you were fighting for your deen. Your driving force was your religion. Today, your driving force is only your dunya. You know, like he's saying that I'm ready to fight. Are you guys ready to fight? And together, his army, what do they say to him? They respond saying, no, we don't want to fight. They say, bal al-baqiyatu wal-hayat, that we want to live. So this very telling incident shows the lack of morale of his army, that huge groups of people didn't want to fight against Muawiyah. The incident of Imam Hassan being attacked by his own army in the city of Madain is unanimously narrated. However, how it actually happened is very differently narrated. For example, Sheikh Mufid, if you go to Kitab al-Irshad, he has one narration there that some of the ulama today who have analyzed it have said that this is not the strongest of narrations. They say that the strongest of narrations is that, the one that makes the most sense at least, is that in an important book of history called Tarikh of Ya'qubi. In the Tarikh of Ya'qubi, the story is like this. When Imam Hassan was in the city of Madain, I told you that he sent Ubaydullah with most of his army up north to Muskin, but he remained in the city of Madain to gather forces. Madain lay at the crossroads of Kufa, Basra, and Iran. He was hoping to gather a larger army and then go up and join with Ubaydullah in Muskin and fight. Anyways, when he was in the city of Madain, at one point Muawiyah makes a plan. Treacherous plan, as was Muawiyah's tactics. Muawiyah didn't want to fight. We'll talk about why he didn't want to fight, inshallah, very soon. What Muawiyah does is he takes letters that the people of Kufa have written to him. This was the true colors of the people of Kufa. Many of the people of Kufa, the heads of the tribes even, they had written him letters proclaiming their allegiance to Muawiyah, saying that, oh Muawiyah, if you bring your army close, we will arrest Imam Hassan, we will kill Imam Hassan, we will hand him over to you. We are your supporters. So Muawiyah sends with a group of 3 people under Mughira, or one of these 3 people was Mughira bin Shu'bah, again somebody we mentioned last week. He sends this, all these letters to Imam al-Hasan. And Imam al-Hasan is shown these letters of how treacherous his own army is. And then apparently they try to convince Imam Hassan that why don't you engage in a sulh? Muawiyah is telling you that let's not fight. You abdicate the caliphate and we'll have a peace treaty between us. There's nothing to indicate that Imam Hassan agreed to a sulh at this time. Imam Hassan was still adamant that he was going to fight against Muawiyah. He had made all preparations for a strong fight. But when these 3 wretched individuals leave the company of Imam al-Hasan, they purposely talk very loudly. And as they're walking through the camps of the army of Imam al-Hasan, very loudly they proclaim that, oh, Alhamdulillah, God has stopped the blood of the Muslims from being shed by the son of the Prophet of Allah. What are they doing? They're instigating the army. They're tricking the army into thinking that Imam Hassan has agreed to a sulh when he hasn't. If he had agreed to a sulh, they wouldn't have needed to do that. The fact that they did it like this, in this tricky way, shows that Imam Hassan hadn't said anything to indicate that he wanted to do a sulh at that time. But when the Khawarij in the army hear these 3 people who have come and who are spreading these lies, they revolt against Imam Hassan. His own army attacks him. his own army, these Khawarij, they steal some of his belongings, and one of these wretched individuals comes and says, Imam al-Hasan, at this time that person who stabbed Imam Hassan, by the way, his name was Jarrah bin Sannan. At this time, some of the Shias, they kill this Jarrah who did that, and they protect Imam Hassan, and they take him to the uncle of Mukhtar, the famous Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. His uncle, whose name was Sa'ad bin Mas'ud. Sa'ad was earlier the governor of Imam Ali, and then Imam Hassan kept him as the governor in Madain, the city. So eventually Imam Hassan goes there to be treated and to recover from this wound that he is afflicted by. This just shows us how weak the army was, how divided the army was, how many hypocrites and khawarij and spies of the Bani Umayyah there were in the army. However, we still have this main question that we want to try to answer. Okay. So to answer this question of why Imam Hassan signed the peace treaty, let us look at the potential options that lay before Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. And here we will try to comment on a very important difference between the time of Imam Hassan versus the time of Imam Hussein. Peace be upon both of them. So one option for Imam Hassan was that he continued to fight. He continues to fight. What would have happened? Undoubtedly, they would have lost. One of two things could have happened if they lost. Either the Ahlul Bayt would have been wiped out, all of the Ahlul Bayt would have been killed, all of the Shia would have been killed, or no, at the very end, maybe Imam Hassan would have been taken prisoner and he would have been spared, his life would have been spared. But imagine what would have happened in both situations. In the second situation, Imam Hassan would have been shown to be like a very, what do you call it, humble and disgraced prisoner who Muawiyah gave mercy to and spared his life. Until the end of his life and until the end of history, Imam Hassan would have been remembered as that, as somebody who was shown a favor to by Muawiyah. Or the Ahlul Bayt would have been totally wiped out. And in both cases, Muawiyah would have remained in power. Although he did remain in power, but there's a fundamental difference between the Ahlul Bayt being there and Muawiyah being in power versus the Ahlul Bayt not being there and Muawiyah being in power. We spoke a little bit last week, I think, about how cunning and sly Muawiyah was, his animosity with Islam, how he had brainwashed the people of Sham, how he had propagated a version of Islam that portrayed him as a very holy individual, and whatever he wanted to, he would brainwash the people to believe. If Muawiyah was at the helm of the Muslim government for 20 years, he lived 20 years after this time, and there was no Ahlul Bayt to preserve, there were no Shia left to preserve the true face of Islam, what would have remained of Islam? The only Islam that would have remained was the Islam that Muawiyah wanted. We would have been left an Islam that portrayed Muawiyah as a great individual, and we wouldn't have known the truth. The true Islam of the Holy Prophet ﷺ would have been wiped out forever. So this is also a very important role of the Ahlul Bayt. After all, the only role of the Ahlul Bayt is not to lead the government. They have other roles, and one of their other roles is to teach people the true version of Islam. So by signing a peace treaty, Imam Hassan assured that he would remain alive to protect Islam. Him and Imam Hussein after him and the Ahlul Bayt who had not been wiped out would have remained to teach people, to show people that Muawiyah, okay, he's in power today, but he's not the true face of Islam. And so in that sense, it made much more sense that he abdicated the throne. And keep in mind that this, I have made an assignment. If you, dear brothers and sisters, get a chance, do look at the website of the Academy for Learning Islam, the website for this course. I put up another reading assignment. Last week's reading assignment was to do with one of the letters that Imam Hassan alayhi salam wrote to Muawiyah early on in his caliphate before he had taken out an army to go and fight. Today's reading assignment is the actual conditions of the sulh. And I've put the 5 conditions and I've put questions to ponder upon about why Imam Hassan put this condition and how did this condition make Muawiyah look in history, and what did this condition mean? Very quickly, like we can see from these conditions that history should be able to tell by looking at this peace treaty that Muawiyah was never recognized as the Khalifa, the true successor to the Prophet. Just this title, Amir al-Mu'mineen, is itself indicative. In the peace treaty, Amir al-Mu'mineen is only used to refer to Imam Ali. It says that Muawiyah is like going to be given the government, but he's not allowed to do this, he's not allowed to do that, he's not allowed to curse Amir al-Mu'mineen, he's not allowed to oppress the Shia. All these conditions are put upon him. So it was very clear to people at that time and throughout history, because this peace treaty has remained with us till now. Although there is details of what exact conditions are there and what conditions are truly authentic and not, that's a disputed matter that I've indicated in the reading assignment. But the point is that history now knows forever that Muawiyah was not somebody who deserved to be the successor to the Prophet. He was somebody who was thirsty for power, and he got that power, but at any cost, at the cost of being a very immoral person, at the cost of oppressing, at the cost of lying. Every one of these conditions that Imam Hassan put, he betrayed them. Muawiyah didn't listen to any of them. And so forever he was disgraced throughout history. And the Ahlul Bayt remained there to show people what the true Islam was. Inshallah, I hope that that clarifies and answers this main question that we had. A few other points are that Muawiyah also, he himself from the very beginning, he didn't want to fight. He was the one who kept saying, let's make a sulh, let's make a sulh, let's make a sulh. It appears that maybe we can say that he was actually scared to fight Imam al-Hasan. He was worried that if these true Shi'as get in the battlefield, they're invincible, they won't be stopped. They may actually, even though their numbers are small, they may actually win. Another aspect is that part of the cunning politics of Muawiyah may have been that he wanted to present himself as the innocent person. He wanted to be able to say, even after he had defeated Imam Hassan and killed Imam Hassan, God forbid, he wanted to be able to say to history that, look, I wanted to have peace. I kept telling him, he wouldn't be lying because he had kept telling him. I kept telling him to sign a peace treaty, but what can I do? He wanted to fight me, so I fought him. This was part of cutting politics of Muawiyah. So Imam Hassan was aware of this, and it only made sense. The only true good option for him was to sign that peace treaty. If you were to ask why didn't he become shaheed, you could be told in response that what does it mean to become shaheed? If somebody gets killed in an act that is not in the interests of Islam, in an act that is actually going to cause problems for the future of Islam, would you really call that shahada? You see, this is very, very different from the situation of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. At the time of Imam al-Hussein, Yazid was not such a cunning politician. Yazid was a very stupid individual. And so Imam Hussein knew that his message would not be buried in history. On the contrary, his message would remain throughout history to wake people up and to show people that we need to take a stance against illegitimate oppressive governments, against un-Islamic governments such as that of Yazid. So both the peace treaty of Imam al-Hasan and the Qiyam of Imam Hussein are things that definitely saved Islam in their own way. Perhaps the secret behind the very beautiful hadith of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said that both Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, al-Hasan wal-Hussein, imaman qama aw qa'ada, that they are the imam regardless of whether they stand or they sit. Maybe it's saying that Imam Hussein will stand and Imam Hassan will sit. Or no, maybe it's saying that both Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, at one time in their life, they will be forced to sit, and at one time in their life, they will begin a stand. Imam Hassan began a stand, but he wasn't able to finish it. Imam al-Hussein began a stand and was martyred at the end. But 10 years prior to Karbala, Imam Hussein was sitting. He was preparing, but he wasn't openly resisting against Muawiyah as long as Muawiyah was alive. So inshallah, I really pray and hope that I have illustrated some of the logic and the wisdom and the need behind the actions of Imam al-Hasan. One last option, of course, was always there for Imam al-Hasan, as he himself indicated in his words. That was never an option for a great individual, somebody with the character and the piety and the purity of Imam al-Hasan. What was that last option that had he engaged in? He definitely would have outwitted Muawiyah. He definitely would have defeated Muawiyah. That was if he, God forbid, were to resort to immoral actions. If he were to resort to some of these cunning policies that Muawiyah was able to resort to, Imam Hassan, just like his father before him, just like all of the Ahlul Bayt, their hands were tied by the Sharia. And that's not a fault on their part. That's not a blemish on their character. In fact, that is an honor for them. In one of his ahadith, Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, he says that if I wanted, I'll just summarize it, it's something like this, that if I wanted this dunya, if I wanted the power, then Muawiyah is not somebody who is more like stronger in his resolve than me. I'm just wording this myself. He's not smarter than me. He's not more able than me to get power. Imagine if Imam al-Hasan had a huge amount of the Muslim world under his control. Okay, Muawiyah had Sham and Palestine towards the end, and Egypt as well towards the end of the life of Imam Ali. Amr ibn al-As, on behalf of Muawiyah, he had defeated the forces of Imam Ali, and Muawiyah had usurped also that land of Palestine and Egypt. But Imam Hassan had all of Iran and Iraq and Yemen and Hijaz under his control. Imagine how much money he had at his disposal. If he wanted to bribe individuals, do you think Amr ibn al-As and Mughira and all Ziyad ibn Abi and all these wretched individuals who came to the aid of Muawiyah, would they not have preferred to go to Imam al-Hasan if Imam al-Hasan was ready to give them money? Of course they would have. On the one hand, he could have bought out people who wanted the dunya. On the other hand, he had his name and his title as the grandson of the Prophet. He had all of the honorable qualities that he had, eloquence and beauty and a lineage that is incomparable. If he wanted to resort to evil tactics, definitely he would have outwitted Muawiyah and he would have taken over. But at what cost? At the cost of giving up his principles? No way. The Ahlul Bayt will never do that. So that was not an option for Imam Hassan alayhi salam. With that, we want to come to an end of this class. I just have a few ahadith here to show that this analysis that our ulama have done, that I've tried to very quickly present to you in this class, many of them are there in the very words of Imam al-Hasan. He lived for another 10 years or so after the peace treaty, and in this time, maybe less than 10 years, but in this time, many times people came to him, people insulted him, other people he just had conversations with perhaps, where he was trying to show them the reasoning behind what he did. In one of the ahadith, he says, if it were not for that which I did, not a single of our Shia would have remained on the face of this earth, except that they would have been killed. In another quote, this quote here before you, in a very kind of, what do you say, like kinaya, like without explicitly saying the reason, he just hints at the reason why. He says, the reason behind my sulh with Muawiyah is the same reason behind the sulh of the Holy Prophet ﷺ that he did in Hudaybiyah and with those tribes of the Kuffar. Why did the Holy Prophet sign a peace treaty? Did he agree with the Kuffar ruling Makkah? Did he agree with their idolatry and their policies of discrimination and mistreatment of women and having a class system of elite and poor oppressed slaves and poor people? No, Prophet didn't agree with any of that. But he knew that this was not the time to fight them. By having a peace treaty, we can become stronger, we can become united, we can grow, and one day the time will come where we will come back and establish a rightful Islamic government, as happened. of course, with the conquest of Makkah. So Imam Hassan, again, it's not like he gave up and he, gave up against Muawiyah and said, okay, that's it. Muawiyah is too strong. I'm going to just go home and sit and pray namaz and that's it. We're not going to do anything to do with the government. No, it was that the situation did not allow him to do anything but to step back, to abdicate the throne for a little while in the hopes that inshallah he can train the Shia community, he can grow the Shia community, and the Muslims will become stronger, more pious, more ready to one day stand up and establish an Islamic government. Definitely that was the goal of Imam al-Hasan. So if we go back to that Quran I quoted to you in the beginning where it said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا لَقِيتُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا زَحْفًا فَلَا تُوَلُّوهُمُ الْأَدْبَارَ. You're not allowed to run away from the enemy in the battle unless وَمَنْ يُوَلِّهِمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ دُبُرَهُ إِلَّا مُتَحَرِّفًا لِقِتَالٍ أَوْ مُتَحَيِّزًا إِلَى فِئَةٍ, unless he is diverting to fight or retiring to another troop. If we wanted to analyze Imam Hassan's, we would have to say that it's one of these. متحرفا لقتال أو متحيزا إلى فئة. But Imam Hassan was just biding his time to get ready to one day take back the rule. Not that he gave in and agreed with the government of Muawiyah. As is very clear, and inshallah, if you get a chance to look at that reading assignment, I hope it will become even clearer from that. The last quote I've put here, that once Imam al-Hussein asked his brother, what made you do tasneem of the caliphate? What made you submit the caliphate? He replied, the same thing that caused, it's a typo, caused your father to do so before. Again, it wasn't like Imam Ali alayhi salam agreed with what happened at Saqifa and after the death of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi, but the situation did not allow him to stand up and fight for his right. He had to wait and try to, help the cause of Islam in the most wise way. And of course, he knew best what was that. Imams, and I pray that we can emulate the Imams in all of our life. I pray that we, inshallah, benefit from our love of the Imams, to reform ourselves, to implement their teachings, to serve them, to obey the rules of Islam, and to be their Shia and be on their force, be their helpers and their supporters until the end of our lives, inshallah. Thank you very much again for attending this class. If there are any questions, I am at your service. If you get a chance to do the reading assignments and want to discuss some of those questions with me, again, feel free to contact me. You can get in touch with me, inshallah. Thank you very much. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alihi at-tabi'in.